Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Catherine Ricker, and I am Executive Director of the Albert Schenker Institute. Thank you so much for joining me tonight and joining the Schenker Institute and AFT as we bring you tonight's webinar, Child Labor Exploitation, What Caring Adults Need to Know. In partnership with AFT and featuring special guests from the U.S. Department of Labor, Brandeis University, and the University of Southern California. Educators, healthcare professionals, and public employees see young people often in their professional settings. We care about them, and we want them supported and protected as they grow up. With reports that evidence of child labor violations are on the rise, and the widely read New York Times investigative story, Alone and Exploited Migrant Children Work Brutal Jobs Across the US, more adults are learning about the perils of child labor and want to do something about it. Additionally, state legislatures have been enacting changes to loosen child labor laws at the same time they are introducing vouchers, which contributes to an environment where children are more vulnerable to exploitation in the workplace. This webinar will provide participants with background information on child labor laws, where to find additional resources and support for children and their families, and examples of union and community partnerships to end child labor exploitation. Tonight's webinar will also be available for on-demand viewing after the live event. And to begin tonight, I'm so excited to welcome Wage and Hour Division Communication Specialist Bridget Dutton to offer Child Labor 101, to ground all of us in the background needed to be the adult advocates our young people need. Bridget is Program Analyst and National Corps Liaison at the Office of Performance and Communication at the U.S. Department of Labor. Bridget, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mary Catherine, and thanks for having us. The Department of Labor is dedicated to helping young workers find those positive and early employment experiences, but the work must be safe. The child labor provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, were enacted to ensure that when young people work, the work does not jeopardize their health or well-being. Today's presentation will provide a high-level overview of these child labor topics: child labor protections by age, hours 14 and 15-year-olds can work, jobs 14 and 15-year-olds can work, dangerous jobs prohibited for all children under the age of 18, child labor protections on farms, and additional resources that the division provides. Generally, the minimum age for employment is 14, although there are some exceptions and exemptions for children under the age of 14 that allow them to babysit on a casual basis and work as actors or performers, for example. However, the Fair Labor Standards Act groups into two categories for employment purposes: 14 and 15-year-olds in one group and 16 and 17-year-olds in the second group. Simply stated, employees aged 14 and 15 years may only work outside of school hours and only for certain time periods, which we will discuss further. They may only work in non-manufacturing, non-mining, and non-dangerous jobs. However, employees that are aged 16 and 17 years may perform any job that is not considered dangerous and with no limit to the number of hours that they work. The child labor regulations do not apply to any employees that are 18 years or older. Lastly, there is a parental exemption for a business who is the sole, or a parental exemption for a person who is the sole owner of a business. A child who works for a company that is entirely owned by their parent may work longer hours, and they also have fewer job restrictions. The number of hours that 14 and 15-year-olds may work depends on whether school is in session or not. For example, when school is in session, 14 and 15-year-olds may not work more than 18 hours. However, when school is not in session, 14 and 15-year-olds may work up to 40 hours in each week. Additionally, 14 and 15-year-olds may only work between the hours of 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., except from June 1st through Labor Day, when the evening hour is extended to 9 p.m. Hour standards violations are very common when discovering child labor violations for 14 and 15-year-olds. Let me point out that many states have different standards, and employers should always check with both state and federal agencies to ensure compliance. Where state and federal laws are different, the most protective law applies. So let's review what jobs 14 and 15-year-olds can and cannot do. They can serve as cashiers, participate in modeling, artwork, or advertising, serve as dishwashers, participate in office and clerical jobs, bagging and carrying out groceries, food prepping by hand, serving as a server or busser, stocking shelves, and certified 15-year-olds may work as lifeguards at swimming pools and amusement parks. 14 and 15-year-olds generally cannot, again, participate in manufacturing, mining or processing, baking or cooking, serving as a public messenger, participating in construction work, including roofing, using or cleaning power-driven equipment, loading and unloading equipment, working in freezers or walk-in coolers, or participate in door-to-door sales. Remember, anything not permitted is prohibited. Although we have been making the distinction between children who are 14 and 15 and those that are 16 and 17, dangerous jobs applies to all children under the age of 18 for work that is not on farms. And these are considered hazardous occupations. You may be asking yourself, what is a hazardous occupation, also known as an HO? An HO is work that the Secretary of Labor has determined is too dangerous for children under the age of 18 to work. There are 17 HOs for work that is not performed on farms. We won't walk through each of these HOs today, but I want to let you know that our website hosts additional compliance assistance materials, which provides more detailed information for the work children can and cannot do. Now let's discuss our child labor protections specific to agriculture. There are major differences between what children can do on farms versus off farms. Although they both have age limitations, hours regulations, and hazardous orders or dangerous jobs, the rules are applied differently. Once a child reaches the age of 16, the child labor rules no longer apply to farm work, and they can do any job on a farm at any time. Children who are 14 and 15 working on farms are restricted to working outside of school hours, but for an unlimited number of hours. However, they are banned from working in dangerous jobs. 12 and 13-year-olds may also work on farm jobs outside of school hours and are also banned from working in dangerous jobs. However, they must either work on farms where their parents or guardians work or have written consent to work from a parent. Children under 12 years may work outside school hours in non-dangerous jobs with parental consent, but only on small farms where none of the employees are subject to the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. The parental exemption allows kids to work in any job on farms owned or operated by their parents or persons standing in place of the parent. This slide summarizes some of the main activities and contributions that the Wage and Hour Division makes to support the prevention and elimination of human trafficking. We actively engage and collaborate with federal and state law enforcement partners by participating in over 80 human trafficking task forces across this country. We are uniquely positioned by often being the first government agency in a business to detect and refer possible human trafficking indicators identified during the normal course of an investigation. When such indicators are detected, Wage and Hour follows established protocols to make referrals to our law enforcement partners. When requested through proper channels by another federal agency, typically an assistant United States attorney or criminal law enforcement agency, we will provide advice or participate in the computation of restitution for victims or penalties against the traffickers. Educators and others play a crucial role in assisting in identifying children who could be involved in illegal and exploitative child labor. Some of the signs may include regular absences or a pattern of arriving late to school, which may indicate that a child is working long hours. Children involved in illegal labor may fall asleep in class or struggle to stay awake. A sudden drop in a child's grades or lack of focus could indicate that the child is overwhelmed with work responsibilities. Additionally, if you see signs of physical injuries such as burns, bruises, or cuts, this may indicate a child's participation in dangerous working conditions. So, who may file a child labor complaint with the Wage and Hour Division? Well, the workers themselves, a parent or guardian of that worker, school officials, other employers, advocacy groups, or other agencies that a child may be affiliated with. If a child, a worker, or their advocate has reviewed our information and believes their workplace rights have been violated, they have the right to file a complaint with us. One of the goals of our outreach programs is to ensure that workers know how to reach us, know how to file a complaint, and understand that we pursue complaints regardless of the worker's immigration status. They can contact us at our phone number or visit our webpage. If contacting by phone, they will be directed to the nearest Wage and Hour office for assistance. There are Wage and Hour offices throughout the country with trained professionals to help complainants. Complaints are confidential. We do not share complainants' names with employers or even confirm that a complaint was filed. We work hard to build and maintain strong relationships with select nonprofit organizations to foster communication and better serve our nation's workers, including our young workers and businesses. Wage and Hour has memorandums of understanding or MOUs with states, agencies, and organizations across the country concerning the various laws that we enforce. These partnerships provide for data sharing, referrals, coordinated enforcement, joint outreach, and compliance assistance. They maximize Wage and Hour's impact and the corresponding benefits for businesses and workers. We also offer numerous resources to assist youth with knowing their rights and the knowledge of the work they can and cannot perform. The Youth Rules Initiative promotes positive and safe working experiences for teens by providing information about protections for young workers to youth, parents, employers, and educators. From the Youth Rules website, you can quickly access information about federal and state labor laws that apply to young workers. As part of the Youth Rules Initiative, the U.S. Department of Labor and its partners develop and distribute informational materials, provide training on federal and state rules governing young workers, increase awareness through public service announcements, and develop other tools designed to increase compliance with federal and state laws. We've also developed a Dangerous Jobs webpage where you can hover over the images to learn more about those jobs where youth are not permitted to work. I want to thank you all for your time and attention while I provided some foundational guidance on our child labor laws. To learn more, I encourage you to visit our website for resources that can assist you and youth that may be engaging in exploitative child labor. I will now turn it back over to Mary Catherine to introduce today's panel. Mary?
Thank you so much, Bridget. I really appreciate that. I took a lot of notes myself, and I'm actually just going to repeat that phone number you gave us all, 1-866-487-9243. We'll also put that in the chat for folks and share it again at the end of this webinar. It was really great to be grounded in Child Labor 101 as we move to the discussion of tonight's child labor exploitation, what caring adults need to know presentation. Next, I am actually really excited that we are joined tonight by Jessica Lumen, the U.S. Department of Labor and Wage and Hour Division Administrator. I get to say, as a point of personal privilege, that Jessica is a fellow Minnesotan and a fellow former commissioner. She served as commissioner of the Department of Labor under Governor Mark Dayton in Minnesota. She has worked at the U.S. Department of Labor since January 20th, 2021, first as Principal Deputy Administrator and now as Administrator of the Wage and Hour Division. Jessica, it's wonderful to have you join us tonight, and we'd love to open the floor to you before we get to the rest of our panelists.
Thank you so much, Mary Catherine, and thanks to everybody for joining us tonight. I'm really grateful that you chose to spend your hour with us. We know you're all incredibly busy with everything that you do, and so thank you. Before we get anywhere further, and then I also want to echo and thank Bridget for her very brief, but I hope very substantive overview of this really important issue. And then, of course, want to thank the Albert Shanker Institute and the American Federation of Teachers for your partnership and for the invitation to join you all here today. So a little bit more about the Wage and Hour Division, just for context, right? We at the Wage and Hour Division at the U.S. Department of Labor, we protect minimum wages and overtime pay. We protect FMLA, other federal labor standards, including the child labor standards that we're here to talk about tonight. Every day, we get to wake up and help 165 million workers at 11 million workplaces across our country. And we are focused, as Bridget said, on protecting the most low wage and vulnerable workers. And there are no more vulnerable workers than children who are in our workforce. We, like all of you, believe that everyone involved in a young worker's life can really play a role in keeping them out of harm's way. And so really, again, want to thank you for staying informed on federal child labor rules, about raising awareness. All of us can prevent and combat child labor exploitation. As Bridget also said, we recognize and understand that there are a lot of important first good jobs that young people have. Everybody on this call had their first job. And we know that those positive work experiences can allow kids to develop skills and earn money and really understand what it's like to be part of the labor force. And that's why we have the Youth Rules program that Bridget talked about, which is the kinds of good jobs that can help workers get on a path to good careers. And we at the Department of Labor very much are focused on creating those meaningful first job experiences. But the Wage and Hour Division, we really are about protecting those vulnerable workers, including kids. And frankly, many of us thought that illegal child labor was a 100-year-old problem. It is not. It is a today problem. As Bridget said, there's really three types of restrictions that we're focused on when we're coming to employing children: restrictions on the minimum age for employment, restrictions on work hours, and prohibitions against children being employed to do dangerous work. But unfortunately, we are seeing children who are in workplaces where they never should be in the first place. And we really have to do better than this. The Biden-Harris administration is focused on doing three things to address child labor exploitation. We've launched a national strategic enforcement initiative. For example, in Tennessee, we investigated an employer where children were building parts for power equipment. And we identified $1.5 million in disgorgement of 30 days profits for that employer who was profiting off of employing illegal child labor. And they also had to pay nearly a $300,000 penalty for violating federal child labor laws. So we have to focus on enforcement. But secondly, we are also taking a whole of government approach in the Biden-Harris administration, and we are leading at the Department of Labor an interagency task force to combat child labor exploitation. And this includes working with the U.S. Department of Education to raise awareness about those good, safe first jobs, but also about red flags of child labor exploitation. And we are, of course, focusing on education and outreach, raising awareness about this incredibly important issue. And so we are, again, so grateful that you all are here, happy to be part of this panel conversation. And I cannot stress this enough. What we are focusing on is the place where, unfortunately, kids are dying, where kids are being employed in places where they're going to get hurt and where it really does jeopardize their education and well-being. That is what we are focused on at the Department of Labor. And I know that you all are very focused on making sure that we are protecting those vulnerable kids. So thank you for everything you do. First of all, for joining us tonight. Also, everything you do as educators, as caregivers, as community members, as workers yourself, and as people who care about kids. And again, thank you for joining us tonight. And I'm going to hand it back over to Mary Catherine, and then looking forward to the panel conversation tonight. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was between you and Bridget to just ground us in this being a today problem. The fact that you mentioned that illegal child labor is a today problem, I think has to really be something that we take away from tonight, that this is not a 100-year-old problem. And I really appreciate you just naming it and the work at the U.S. Department of Labor to address illegal child labor. I'd love to welcome our panelists now, and let's bring our panelists in, and let's do some opening questions. First, let's welcome David Wild. David is currently a professor at Brandeis University. He has previously served as the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division Administrator as well. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, David.
Thank you. Great to be
And
here.
then, wonderful. Let's also welcome Kent Wong. Kent is Project Director for Labor and Community Partnerships and former director at the UCLA Labor Center. He was the founding president of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance and the founding president of the United Association for Labor Education. And he is currently vice president of the California Federation of Teachers. Welcome, Kent.
Thanks very much. Great to be with you.
And I'd like to welcome Jack Kearns. Jack Kearns is a policy advocate at the UCLA Labor Center and a recent graduate of UCLA with a master's degree in public policy. One of Jack's projects as a graduate student researcher included researching the rise of child labor violations and the push to weaken child labor laws around the country. Welcome to you too, Jack.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for all of you being here. The first question, Jessica, I'd love to go back to you to just talk about the magnitude of the problem, of this today problem of illegal child labor.
Yeah, and again, you're exactly right. This is something that we have all got to refocus on, unfortunately, because this is a today problem. You may have heard since 2019, the Department of Labor, we've seen about an 88% increase in the number of children employed in violation of federal child labor laws. And so that, again, that's what we found, which means that that is based on us conducting investigations of employers and identifying illegal child labor. I think it's really important that you know that part of the work of the Wage and Hour Division is that we go to workplaces where we believe that violations are most likely to occur. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you can extrapolate in terms of sort of prevalence of this happening. But you can know that the U.S. Department of Labor, the Wage and Hour Division, we are investigating every tip, referral, complaint, and as well as ensuring in all of our other cases related to minimum wages and overtime that there is also child labor compliance. So we very much prioritize looking for child labor. So far in this administration, we've found more than 15,000 children employed in violation of federal child labor laws. And that includes children who are working in hazardous occupations, right? So we talked a little bit about, Bridget talked a little bit about that, and just want to put a little bit fine point on it. Just in 2023, which is the most recent final fiscal year that we have information for, we did find over 500 children that were employed in those hazardous occupations, in those workplaces where kids should never be employed in the first place. And so I just think that the scope of the problem frankly, is something that should make us all think about how we can intervene, how we can protect kids, how we can think about how this might be happening in our communities.
Thank you so much. And are there more prevalent occupations or industries where we're finding these violations that we should all be aware of?
Yeah, so again, I would like to say that this is isolated, but it is not. We are actually finding children employed in a violation of federal child labor laws across every type of industry, where we see. Hi, Randy. Every type of industry where we are conducting investigations. And so I think one of the things that's really important for us to think about is we did a really big case about 1.5 years ago where we found more than 100 children being employed in violation of federal child labor laws, cleaning the kill room floors at meat processing plants across 8 different states, 13 different companies. So I think it's really important that we know that people knew that these kids were going to work in these workplaces. And so we are seeing children. We're seeing violations in restaurants, grocery stores, retail businesses, and amusement and recreation establishments where kids can be employed safely, but they're working too many hours, or they're working on days when they shouldn't be working, or they're using equipment that they can't be using, like cooking or using baking equipment. And then we're also seeing children employed in hazardous occupations, driving vehicles, power machines, those kinds of things. But I think what I'm really focused on, and I know that the folks on the panel are really focused on, and we hope that everybody will help us focus on, is when children are being employed in meat and poultry meat and poultry packing and processing, construction, manufacturing jobs. This is where we are seeing really detrimental impacts on kids. And again, unfortunately, we are seeing children falling from roofs. We are seeing children who are being crushed by vehicles and equipment. And we even had a child who was employed in a sawmill in Wisconsin and was killed based on the injuries that they suffered in that workplace. So this is happening right now, every day, and we're really, really concerned about it.
Thank you. It's such a stark reminder of those signs of exploitation of child labor that Bridget gave us in her Child Labor 101 presentation, right? Those of us who care so much about young people in our lives, whether we are educators or healthcare professionals or public employees in our libraries and our rec programs and everything else, to be just looking for those absences, patterns of late arrival, that sleepiness that students may suddenly exhibit, or that sudden drop of grades or loss of focus. And then really, to your point of some of these egregious examples you at the Department of Labor are finding, those injuries like burns or bruises or cuts that suddenly are showing up, that again, our healthcare providers, our school nurses, others may be aware of. Stitching all of this together really shows how important it is for caring adults to step up and lead in this position. And I could not be happier to have this panel joined right now by AFT and Schenker Institute President Randy Weingarten. Randy has been leading the AFT and ASI since 2008. Before that, she was president of UFT and a social studies teacher in New York City. And she has spent her career working to improve people's lives. Randy, thank you so much for joining us and for your longtime leadership in addressing child safety.
Well, look, I'm glad to be with so many of my long-term pals here who are on this Zoom, who I've known, I feel like, for a generation or so, if not more. My apologies for, we're in the middle of getting out the vote, but I really wanted to be out here with all of you for a minute. Thank you, Jessica, for what you just said, and Ken, thank you, and Mary Catherine for wanting to do this. And David, I just want to say thank you for everything, period, full stop. But, what's happened is that what we're seeing is that you see two phenomena in states like Iowa and Arkansas, which is there is a whittling down of the basically basic rights for kids to be in school and responsibilities to have school. And this really kind of evisceration of the child labor laws in the same time. And states like Iowa and Arkansas in particular have done both at the same time. And when somebody starts lifting up things like homeschooling, like people have a right to homeschool, they have a right to send their kids to religious and parochial schools. That's ultimately, a parent's right. But we also have a responsibility to be ensuring the best interest of our young people. And we all have a responsibility to be in locus parentis. And part of what's going on here is that kids are being used as they were 100 years ago to actually help ensure that a family can make ends meet, as opposed to do what we need to do to raise wages and make sure that kids can be kids. So there's a lot that we need to unpack here, but we wanted to ensure that our membership started seeing these trends in a real way and what we need to do to fight this. Think about at the turn of the last century, one of the things that happened was the books about the meat packing industry, was about what happened at the Triangle Shirt Waste Factory fire. And these became clarion calls that said that we as a society needed to do better in order to ensure that we were nurturing our young people and also ensuring that their workplaces, just like their school places, were safe and welcoming. And I think that we as a labor movement, that is our role again, to call out, to actually understand and unpack why this is happening. And we don't have a race to the bottom, but we have a race to the top in a way where we are nurturing our children and we're also making sure their families can thrive. And that is why laws about being in school and making sure school is interesting and fun and having the kind of workforce pathways that we've been talking about a lot, so that we help kids when they graduate from high school have a job that commands a great wage, as opposed to when they are before they're in junior high school, have a wage that is lower than minimum wage, where they can actually be killed by a meat packing plant. And we have to do all of these things at the same time. And so I'm very, very, very grateful for the people who are advocating against the exploitation of children and against child labor, and also for the people who are actually in the government trying to make sure that exploitation doesn't happen. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for this webinar too. Thank you, Mary Catherine.
Thank you so much, Randy. Really appreciate you being able to join us and your support for making sure that workers, those caring adults in the lives of children, are educated about this and stand up, and then work in partnership with the Department of Labor and all their tremendous resources, so so that we can address illegal child labor where it's happening and work to create those really robust, healthy opportunities for our young people that you are doing so much of with experiential learning and career and technical education. And those, Jessica, as you talked about, those healthy first jobs for young people. Really wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us, Randy. David, I'd love to bring you into this as well. Just given that depth of experience you've had in this area, Jessica had just been talking about those industries where we are seeing some of these violations, and I wonder what sort of patterns you are seeing, or what sort of trends you are seeing as well that that we should be aware of.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Catherine. And I think we all know there are always ongoing problems in some of the industries that Bridget and Jessica talked about, where some labor, children are allowed, younger people are allowed to work some. I think what is so shocking about the current wave are these industries where we haven't seen children in large numbers working in decades and decades: meat processing, chicken processing, auto manufacturing, um, packaged food plants. These are all places where I think everyone's assumptions, this is a practice of the ancient past. And to see the numbers sort of raises the question, why is this happening? And I think one pattern in many of those manufacturing industries, and it's been part of the very creative response that I think the Wage and Hour Division has done with the solicitor's office in attacking this problem, is a pattern of major companies, many of whom we know their names: Kia, Hyundai, J&B Meats. These are companies that have products that are very well known, have in their factories used intermediaries, something I've called in my work fissuring, to actually find people to do certain activities. So in meat processing, a company called TSSI was used by many of the major meat processors to do cleaning work. PSSI, in turn, which is a major company owned by BlackRock, operating in multiple states, went out, rather than directly hiring workers, worked through labor brokers and staffing agencies in local areas to find workers. And unfortunately, many of the workers that were tapped by these companies, these large companies, to ultimately fulfill the work in places, as Jessica said, like the killing floors of meat packers, were children. And were children who were very vulnerable and very much in need of economic opportunities because of the conditions they found themselves, and in the need, in some cases, to send money home to families in their home countries, paying back people who they were staying with in this country. A whole host of reasons that made these children very vulnerable and seeking this kind of work. And what I just described in meat processing is also true what happened in the auto manufacturing industry, where, again, intermediaries between named auto manufacturers like Hyundai and Kia work through labor brokers to find a workforce, very often those being child laborers. So unfortunately, the common denominator in many of the cases that the Wage and Hour Division have been undertaking the work on happen through these multiple chains. And often where you have the company that sits at the top of these structures saying the classic line, "Oh, we would never directly hire workers, children workers. We find that abhorrent." But because of the organizational practices they're using, unfortunately, those children are doing the work that should be prohibited under our law, that is prohibited under our law. And I think that's one of the most troubling aspects of many of these cases.
That just explaining fissuring so consumers of conscience can actually start understanding how to stand up for workers, especially for our youngest workers, has just been a really valuable contribution to tonight's webinar and education. So thank you. Jack and Kent, I would love to go to you. Jack, your work on on researching the rise of child labor violations, in particular. And I'd love to hear both of you in the research you've done and the advocacy you've done in the community, who is vulnerable to being exploited, as adults who care deeply, work in this area. What should we know about our most vulnerable young people?
Thanks so much, Mary Catherine, for hosting this. Thank you to the Albert Shanker Institute and the American Federation of Teachers. And this is a very important issue that educators, that the community at large needs to understand. For many years, the UCLA Labor Center has been engaged in research and policy with regard to young workers. We have a long history with Acting Secretary Julie Su of the Secretary of Labor back from the days that she was a labor commissioner and Secretary of Labor here in the state of California, and has been a long-term advocate against these worker injustice and abuses of workers within our society today. I think it's really important to understand that a significant proportion of child labor violations occur within immigrant communities, and that immigrant youth are in particular vulnerable to the exploitation that they face on the job. I was so glad that David Weil raised this issue of the use and abuse of labor contractors, which is prevalent in many parts of the immigrant workforce in this country. And unfortunately, the very ugly, mean-spirited attacks on immigrant communities that has been on the rise during the presidential election rhetoric has had a extremely damaging impact on immigrant workers and immigrant youth themselves, who are unable to freely exercise their rights as workers and are intimidated and afraid to speak out against labor abuses on the job. And this is especially true with immigrant youth. And so I wanted to call on, my colleague Jack Kearns, who has been spearheading the research and policy work. This has been funded and supported by the New World Foundation, who has been a huge champion for worker justice and worker rights. But Jack, if you could please briefly share some of the research that we have uncovered.
Yeah, thanks, Kent. Thanks so much for having us to talk about this issue. When we ask the question of how do children find themselves in these positions, to state it plainly, these children find themselves in these positions because they need the extra money to survive. And large corporations know this, and they try to take advantage of this vulnerability. At the UCLA Labor Center, we've been engaged in research on the rise in child labor for the past year, presenting our findings to various organizations in the hopes of building a broad coalition interested in fighting back against this issue. As part of our research, we actually interviewed several young adults who worked in hazardous industries as children as recently as a few years ago. This included picking grapes in agricultural fields, roofing homes, working in a sawmill cutting wood with large electrical saws, working in a greenhouse for a full shift where temperatures reached 120 degrees. All these workers agreed that no child should ever have to work their respective job, but they all had to accept their job out of necessity. So continuing off of Kent's point about who is most vulnerable, many of you know there's also been a huge rise in unaccompanied migrant children coming to the United States who are attempting to escape poverty or violence, coming to the United States to make money for their family back home. And many of these children get trafficked into work, but it's also important to remember that many others have agency in deciding, look, I need to work, I need to support my family somehow, I will accept this job, even if it means I have to miss school. And this opens the door to accept a bad job where they're exploited. So while we do need be urgent in ensuring children do not work in these hazardous conditions that we've mentioned, like a slaughterhouse, we also need a holistic approach to child labor, which ensures that children, A, have access to some kind of job where they can attend school, make enough money for themselves and their family to live and not be exploited, or B, more ideally, is create the social safety nets and pay living wages to ensure that no child ever has to live in poverty or work to survive and can focus on school and being a kid. So as you've heard, this is a widespread problem occurring all over the country, red states and blue states. Data has shown that 49 out of 50 states in the past 6 years have had some kind of minor being employed in violation. So we really need to organize and build a coalition to fight this and ensure our children can be safe and healthy and obtain a quality education. So if anyone is interested in scheduling an event with us at the Labor Center and the New World Foundation, where we can present a more thorough presentation of this issue, please reach out to me or Kent, so we can share information at the end of this. Thank you.
Thank you both, Kent and Jack. Jack, as you talked about what can be done, like improving the social safety net as one example, I'd actually invite all of our panelists to offer from their perspectives what can be done to stop child labor exploitation. We have spent some really important time in this webinar learning just like what to look for. And I know everyone on this webinar and everyone tuning in, either live or on demand, wants to know, so then what do I do next? What can be done to end child labor exploitation? Jessica, do you want to go first?
Sure, I will. And I, again, appreciate all of the really great insight from everyone on the panel. So in some ways we know what we have to do, right? First of all, we know, one, we're never going to enforce our way into an economy that works for everyone. And we're never going to enforce our way into a economy that works for every kid. But we know the Wage and Hour Division and the Department of Labor, and frankly, across everyone who cares about this issue, we know we have to hold employers accountable for employing children in violation of federal child labor laws. Like, we can't lose track of that immediate need. We also have to make sure that exploited children aren't re-victimized. So that means that we have to make sure that we're working with community-based organizations, leaders, immigrant communities, worker centers, to make sure unions, to make sure that that we are providing support and services to vulnerable kids. And, you know, and Kent and Jack talked a little bit about who some of those vulnerable kids are. But you all on this webinar are particularly attuned to who in your community are the most vulnerable kids. And a lot of it is about economic instability and economic insecurity. And so if we can make sure that we are recognizing that these kids are victims of so many of the realities in their own lives, and how do we support and protect those workers and those kids? We also know that we have to hold, and David talked a little bit about this, we also have to hold supply chains responsible for ensuring that no one is profiting off of products or services that are made by illegal child labor. And that's something that we all can do as community members and as consumers and as people who are engaging every single day and thinking about our role in protecting our communities and the economies that we are part of. And so we are seeing a lot of that work, and David was talking a little bit about that too. We are doing a lot of work to hold responsible, even if they aren't necessarily the employer of the children themselves. They are profiting from the illegal child labor in their supply chains, and we need to hold them accountable for that. And then, of course, we all have to care. And everybody that joined on this webinar, everybody has to care. And so you all are caregivers in everything that you do. I consider myself as a parent and as a public servant a caregiver. And so if you are worried about a kid that is working in a dangerous workplace, if you are worried about an exploited child, it's just important to make the call. You need to call the Wage and Hour Division. You need to call a community-based organization. You need to make that call, because again, back seed point one, which is when we hold employers accountable for employing children in violation of federal child labor laws, that's when we're going to break this cycle.
Fantastic. Thank you. That is a great list of things to do for sure. David, what would you add? What can be done to end child labor exploitation? What would you add to everything everyone has shared?
Well, I think Jessica's really laid out the important big issues. I would just highlight, companies like General Mills, Frito-Lay, Quaker Oats are all companies that have used middlemen that have employed children workers in packaged foods. So there are a lot of places where we have a lot of products we buy that we might not associate with these practices, and the companies actively want to distance themselves for the problem. And I think Jessica's exactly right. We have to hold accountable those companies and say, you can do better. You invest a lot in your brand, and your brand is tarnished when you are even indirectly engaged in these things. The second thing I would emphasize, and without going into the details, I would just say the Wage and Hour Division, the Solicitor of Labor, the Department of Labor have been doing amazing work on trying to hold all the parties accountable. But I will tell you that work takes a lot of resources and investigators, time, regional solicitors. You have to do a lot of hard work to undertake these cases. And one of the things we can all do as citizens is put pressure on our legislators to make sure we resource these critical agencies so they have the number of investigators and then staff to do this work. And that's ultimately Congress is responsible, and to hold Congress responsible for really making sure that these critical agencies are able to do the work they're doing. And then the last is the reason why Mary Catherine is so wonderful that Albert Shanker Institute is funding this. You know, the original, I'm very proud of my state, in 1852, Massachusetts was the first state to pass a child labor law. And I'm a bit of a history geek. When I look at some of the early efforts in Massachusetts and some of the other early states, they reached out to schools and teachers to help them identify, even in those days, the potential for a problem of children who should be in school, who would be working. That link remains as important today, and particularly where we're dealing with children who are really in harm's way in some of the places they're working.
I agree with everything that Jessica and David raised. I would just add that we as educators have a special responsibility to address this issue. And when Jack and I have gone all over the country making presentations, talking about the problems that exist to this day on child labor, many people think that this is a problem that does not exist. Many people think this is a problem that existed 100 years ago, and we don't have to concern ourselves today. And so I think that we as educators have a special responsibility and a special opportunity to lift up the stories of our students who are facing these exploitative conditions on the job. The other thing is that I really think we need to identify the corporate greed that is motivating the exploitation of children, the use and abuse of contract labor, which shields corporations from responsibility, from corporate responsibility, and the nationally coordinated efforts by right-wing forces to roll back child labor protections. It is not happening by accident or spontaneous. This is a nationally coordinated campaign. And so we need, as educators, as community, labor, government, we need to work together to address how to proactively, on the policy arena, defend the rights of our children.
Thank you all so much. David, I wanted to come back to you and just ask about this. One, you talked about pressuring legislators to resource departments like the Department of Labor. And I want to make sure that everyone heard that point. And I'm wondering if there is any pending or existing legislation that is weakening current child labor laws that you are tracking or that we should be aware of, or, you know, in these upcoming state legislative sessions this winter, what should we be on the, you know, again, as caring adults, what should we be on the lookout for?
Yeah, no, that's a great and very important question. At the federal level, there's good news. And the good news is Senators Casey and Murray, along with Representative DeLauro and other colleagues, have proposed legislation originally introduced in 2023 called the Child Labor Act. It's an acronym. I won't go into all the pieces that make it the Child Labor Act, but it's a good name for it. And it has a number of very important provisions. I think most important is it would appreciably increase the penalties associated with violations, the civil monetary penalties that the Department of Labor is able to levy when they find these violations. Again, kudos to the Department of Labor for the Wage and Hour Division. In investigations, they have used the maximum penalties in many of these cases available, but they're simply not enough. The PSSI company I mentioned that faced the maximum penalties under the law, that represented $1.5 million. That in the proposed legislation that Senators Casey and Murray and Representative DeLauro put up, that would be magnified by a factor of 100. Now, that's obviously something only Congress can do, is to raise it to that. But if we really care about this as a problem, we have to change the penalty structure. Their proposed act also talks about criminal penalties, particularly where you have egregious and repeat violations. And it has other provisions that would strengthen the hand of the Department of Labor in really attaching responsibility all the way up the chain. So there's a great need to support this legislation once Congress comes back. Hopefully in a President Harris administration, this should really be a first order of business in terms of its importance. There's bad news and there's good news at the state level. The bad news really started in 2023, which was, as Kent mentioned, through a protracted, coordinated effort by an organization funded by billionaires to roll back state-level legislation. The worst case of this was the state of Iowa that ultimately passed, and the governor signed a bill that is in defiance of the Fair Labor Standards Act. It does things that, in fact, violate the Fair Labor Standards Act because you're not allowed to go below the standards set by the federal government. That legislation does that. There were other states that similarly sought in 2023 to roll back and sadly were successful in doing that. And it's the Foundation for Government Accountability is the organization I would call out as behind these efforts to roll back state laws on this. And there are a number of states in the 2024 period that have continued this effort to relax the laws, and that includes Iowa. As bad as it was, they have managed to even find new ways to make the conditions worse. Now, having said that, there's some good news, and the good news is there are a number of states that have actually strengthened their child labor provisions. A state can go above and beyond what the federal government does. I was born and raised in Colorado. I'm proud to say Colorado put forward legislation to raise the standards. Minnesota, of course, with wonderful Governor Walz, put forward strengthening that. But even in some red states, Nebraska strengthened penalty structures under their child labor laws. Utah has done some movement in the right direction, the state of Virginia. So there are instances, and it's important to track this. The Economic Policy Institute has a wonderful set of papers on this. National Employment Law Project follows this very closely, where I think we have to, if you're in a state where there is strengthening legislation going on, then you can get behind those efforts. And also, we really need to raise up the many states that are trying to push in the wrong direction.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you to all of our panelists tonight. You have really packed this hour with so much for us to have learned, as well as things for us to do to make sure that we are the best advocates we can be for the young people in our lives. I heard so much as I close out tonight. to just sort of summarize everything we have learned, again, we need to act, we need to learn and act both as individuals and in a collective way. As individuals, we can look for those signs of exploitive child labor. Again, what Bridget shared with us, those absences, that pattern of late arrival, that sleepiness, that sudden drop of grades or a lack of focus. And certainly if we are seeing injuries like burns or bruises or cuts, we should all have that number at the ready, and everyone who registered for this webinar will get a follow-up email with that phone number and some of these recommendations. Again, that number, if you're going to write it down tonight, is 1-866-487-9243. And as Jessica told us, illegal child labor is a today problem. We need to be aware as again, as consumers of conscience, we need to be aware of fissuring, that companies will use an intermediary or a labor broker to find workers, and those workers are often vulnerable. And that's where we're vulnerable to child labor, exploitive child labor, as both Kent and Jack shared with us, that a significant portion of child labor violations are happening in immigrant communities. And sometimes these children are trafficked, but as Jack pointed out, sometimes unaccompanied migrant children have chosen the job because of their family's need for the money or because of their situation. So we have to be aware that we can intervene as the adults in their lives, and we can do something to end illegal child labor. Again, like Jack said, to improve the social safety net, or Jessica's work to hold employers accountable. We get to make that call. The Department of Labor gets to follow up on that trail. And as David pointed out, these incredibly dedicated public servants need to be well resourced. We have to let our legislators know, and we can do this as individuals, we can do this as professionals in a collective, as educators together, as healthcare professionals together, public employees together, all of us who care about the safety and the lives of our children. We can let legislators know this issue is important to us, and we expect them to be partners with us in keeping our young people safe and making sure that those first jobs, again, are healthy first jobs that that help set our young people up for success. It's great to end by hearing that there's some good news at the federal level and at the state level, but also the cautionary tale that there is some bad news out there as well, and we should all be aware of it. To close, I would just love to also ask folks who are listening in, either live or on demand, to consider joining the campaign to end U.S. child labor. And you can go to End U.S. Child Labor, as if that's all one word, enduschildlabor.org. And we look forward to continuing to support our young people in all the ways we can. I want to thank everyone who joined us today for caring. I want to thank our panelists, Jessica, David, Kent, Jack, Bridget. Thank you, Randy. Thank you all for sharing your expertise with us and making us stronger advocates for the young people in our lives with the work you do. Have a great night, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Take care.